The casino that bombed Persia. On Miriam Adelson, The New York Times, and the Tribal Accountants of American Defeat. By Elias Winter, May 24, 2026. Read by an automated voice. 1. The Trial of the Very Serious People. In America, no one causes a war. Wars happen. They emerge like weather systems, recessions, opioid epidemics, and mysterious accounting irregularities. A war arrives already wrapped in passive voice. Mistakes were made, intelligence was assessed, options were considered, concerns were raised, red lines were crossed, the situation deteriorated. Escalation became unavoidable. No one did anything. The donor donated. The columnist opined. The think tank fellow warned. The senator expressed grave concern. The newspaper provided context. The editor maintained standards. The billionaire sought peace through strength. The retired general appeared on cable news because the graphics department had already made the map. The president acted reluctantly, surrounded by flags and advisors who understood that history is mostly a matter of lighting. And when the war failed, when Iran did not collapse, when the Middle East was not remade, when American prestige did not return from wherever it had gone to die, when the Strait of Hormuz became a word ordinary people suddenly had to pronounce at breakfast, the authors of the fantasy all looked up from their panels, podcasts, board seats, and donor receptions with the same wounded expression. Who? Us? We were merely concerned. That is the genius of the American war class. It can turn appetite into analysis, tribal loyalty into national interest, panic into strategy, and failure into a fellowship at a policy institute. No one is guilty because no one acted alone. The guilt is distributed, securitized, laundered, and finally published as a sober retrospective in a serious newspaper under the headline, What Iran Taught Us About Readiness. The country is invited to learn lessons from the disaster. Not moral lessons, of course. Not lessons about arrogance, capture, fantasy, or the strange way American power keeps finding itself attached to other people's sacred obsessions. No. The lessons are technical. We need more drones, better counter-drone systems, deeper magazines, faster procurement, stronger alliances, more resilient supply chains, a renewed industrial base. The empire's preferred apology is a purchase order. But before the procurement conference begins, before the columnists explain that they were right in a deeper sense, before the donors return to the table with another plan to save civilization from the consequences of their previous plan, a trial is necessary. Not a legal trial. America has laws, and the powerful know how to stand just outside them, smiling. This must be a different kind of trial, a trial of judgment. The defendants are not a people, not Jews, not Israelis, not Iranians, not Americans who were afraid after October 7th, or horrified by the Islamic Republic, or disgusted by clerical repression, or moved by the suffering of Palestinians, or attached to Israel as memory, refuge, wound, or promise. Those are human attachments, and they deserve to be examined with care. The defendants are more specific. They are the people who converted attachment into policy. The people who confused Israel's security narrative with American strategy. The people who mistook hatred of the Islamic Republic for knowledge of Iran. The people who sold vulnerability as destiny. The people who said the Middle East had been redefined because they had forgotten that reality gets a vote. The people who used the language of democracy to endanger protesters, the language of civilization to excuse bombardment, and the language of seriousness to smuggle in tribal panic. They are the tribal accountants of empire. And the indictment is simple. America did not merely lose a war. It lost a fantasy, and the fantasy had authors. 2. The word regime and other small explosives. Every war begins with a noun. The noun must be small enough to bomb. Not Iran. Iran is too large. Iran has mountains, poets, engineers, grandmothers, missile scientists, satellite programs, oil fields, dissidents, clerics, atheists, bazaars, mathematicians, dead kings, living wounds, and a memory longer than most American institutions. You cannot bomb all that without admitting what you are doing. So the noun becomes smaller. The regime. Smaller still. The mullahs. There it is, the perfect little target. A word with a beard. A word with bad lighting. A word that smells, to the American imagination, of fanaticism, backwardness, irrationality, and women hidden under cloth. A word that reassures the bomber that he is not attacking a country. He is attacking a costume. The regime of the mullahs is not analysis. It is stage design. The Islamic Republic has a name. It should be called by its name. It is not a vague gathering of turbans around a cauldron. It is a state formation, a clerical security order, a revolutionary republic, an intelligence system, a military apparatus, a bureaucracy, a patronage network, an ideological machine, and a government that has repressed many of its own citizens with cruelty and fear. It is all of that. But Iran is not identical to it. This distinction should not be difficult. A child can understand that a government is not the same thing as a country. A dissident can hate the ruling order and love the civilization beneath it. A citizen can despise the men who govern him and still refuse to invite foreign bombs onto his mother's street. Yet American war language depends on destroying this distinction. It collapses government into state, state into society, society into ideology, ideology into target. Once the target is small enough, the moral imagination relaxes. The same people who cannot distinguish Iran from the Islamic Republic would, if America fell under Christian nationalist rule, be offended if the rest of the world referred to the United States as the regime of the pastors. They would object, correctly, that America is more than its theocrats. It has universities, laboratories, engineers, soldiers, judges, artists, agencies, logistics, infrastructure, memory, and millions of citizens who did not consent to being reduced to the worst men in office. But give some of these same Americans a map of the Middle East, and suddenly nuance expires. If the MAGA imagination had its full sacramental way, America might become the Christian Nationalist Republic of America, the sister state of the Islamic Republic, with turbans replaced by crosses, morality police replaced by school boards, clerical guardianship replaced by podcast theology, and the official press briefing conducted beneath the glowing cross of Caroline Leavitt's America. The satire writes itself because the symmetry is too embarrassing to need invention. A theocracy is ugly in a turban. It is also ugly in a flag pin. But ugliness is not weakness. That was the great American error. The Islamic Republic may be illegitimate in the eyes of many Iranians. It may be morally exhausted. It may be corrupt, frightened, repressive, paranoid, and historically trapped. But none of that means the Iranian state is flimsy. None of that means its engineers cannot build. None of that means its military cannot plan. None of that means its missile forces are theatrical. None of that means its scientists are stupid. None of that means the country is waiting, like a stage prop, to fall over when a serious Western columnist exhales. The word mullah did the work that intelligence failed to do. It allowed disgust to masquerade as assessment. And that is where the explosions began. Not in the sky, in the noun. 3. The country beneath the turban. There is a country beneath the turban. That sentence is obvious only to those who have not been trained by empire to forget it. Iran is not an inflatable theocracy. It is not a seminarian's tent pitched temporarily on oil fields. It is not a failed state in waiting, held together by slogans and fear. It is an old country with a modern state apparatus. Its government may be ideologically rigid, but its state capacity is not a hallucination. Its rulers may be illegitimate, but its scientists are real. Its clerics may speak in eschatology, but its engineers speak in tolerances, fuel mixtures, guidance systems, metallurgy, encrypted communications, and production schedules. One of the stupidest beliefs in American foreign policy is that moral repulsion provides strategic knowledge. It does not. Sometimes the thing you hate is incompetent. Sometimes the thing you hate is capable. Sometimes the thing you hate is corrupt and capable, brutal and intelligent, ideologically narrow and technically sophisticated. History is full of such combinations. Internal repression and external competence have often lived in the same house. But the American imagination, especially when lubricated by punditry, prefers fairy tales. Bad regimes are brittle. Evil leaders are irrational. Oppressed people are waiting for liberation from the sky. Military pressure reveals the truth. The tyrant is a paper tiger. The population will rise. The security forces will fracture. The region will be remade. Democracy will find a runway. We have heard this before. Iraq was supposed to become a demonstration. Libya was supposed to become a liberation. Afghanistan was supposed to become a project. Syria was supposed to become a morality play with manageable consequences. Again and again, the same theological error returned wearing different policy language. If the ruler is bad enough, collapse is already morally guaranteed. Iran was the worst possible country on which to perform this stupidity. Iran has been invaded, sanctioned, isolated, infiltrated, threatened, and humiliated. It has also endured. It has learned, sometimes badly, sometimes brutally, always under pressure. It built deterrence not because its rulers are noble, but because vulnerable states learn the grammar of survival. It invested in missiles, proxies, drones, asymmetric warfare, air defenses, cyber capacity, and redundancy, because countries surrounded by enemies do not get to major in sentiment. To say this is not to praise the Islamic Republic. It is to admit that reality is not obliged to flatter our moral preferences. The war narrative required a smaller Iran. It needed a country without depth. It needed a brittle regime, an exhausted society, a degraded regional network, and a military that existed mostly to be embarrassed by superior Western technology. It needed the mullahs to be not only ugly, but incompetent. It needed Hezbollah weakened, Syria transformed, air defenses destroyed, deterrence broken, and the Iranian public ready to convert bombardment into gratitude. It needed a cartoon. The cartoon had a plot. Israel had redefined the Middle East. Iran was exposed. America could enter at the decisive moment. The Islamic Republic would tremble. The people would rise. The region would exhale. But Iran was not a cartoon. It was a country. And countries do not care what columnists need them to be. This was the category error at the center of the disaster. They mistook a turban for a target, a government for a civilization, damage for victory, and vulnerability for defeat. A state can bleed and still fight. A deterrent can be degraded and still deter. A society can hate its rulers and still oppose foreign attack. A military can absorb losses and still impose costs. A regime can be despised and still use invasion to restore its claim to national defense. The people who claimed to understand the Middle East forgot the first lesson of politics. A bad government does not abolish the country beneath it. 4. How to lose a war and keep your column. The columnist is one of the strangest creatures in the American ecosystem. He is paid not to know, but to sound as though knowing has become tedious. He can be wrong in the morning, invited to a panel in the afternoon, and republished by dinner. His accountability is atmospheric. His errors evaporate upward into reputation. He does not fail. He evolves. He does not retract. He complicates. He does not apologize. He warns of a different danger. The great advantage of the columnist is that he never pulls the trigger. He only adjusts the room temperature until someone else does. The New York Times did not need to run a banner demanding war with Iran. That would have been vulgar, and vulgarity is for lesser empires. The more refined method is preparation. You build a moral climate. You select adjectives. You decide which fears are serious and which are hysterical. You decide which victims receive names and which receive numbers. You decide when occupation is background and when security is context. You decide when a regime is irredeemable, when diplomacy is naive, when force is regrettable, when escalation is understandable, and when a military window must not be missed. By the time the bomb arrives, it feels like a conclusion. That is how respectable newspapers prepare respectable readers for respectable disasters. The Iran narrative did not appear all at once. It accumulated. Israel had degraded Hezbollah. Israel had restored deterrence. Israel had exposed Iran. Syria had shifted. The region had been redefined. Iran was weaker than it looked. Its air defenses were vulnerable. Its proxies were damaged. Its regime was brittle. Its people were restless. Its rulers understood only force. Its retaliation would be manageable. The old caution was cowardice. The new seriousness was escalation. This was not merely reporting. It was an ontology. The world was arranged so that war became the adult position. And the genius of this arrangement was that it could deny being pro-war. It could say, "We are not advocating reckless invasion. We are merely recognizing reality. We are not demanding regime change. We are merely saying the regime is irredeemable. We are not minimizing Iranian capacity. We are merely observing its vulnerability. We are not laundering Israeli strategy. We are merely interviewing officials familiar with the matter." The washing machine hummed beautifully. Israeli strategic fantasy went in covered in fingerprints. It came out smelling like sober analysis. The fantasy said Israel had redefined the Middle East. The Times helped make the fantasy respectable. Not always, not in every article, not without exceptions. Good reporters sometimes broke through. Damaging facts about Israel appeared. Internal contradictions surfaced. But the baseline grammar favored the Israeli frame. Israel acted. Iran threatened. Israel degraded. Iran retaliated. Israel defended. Iran destabilized. Israel's fear was strategic. Iranian fear was fanatic. The difference was rarely in the facts alone. It was in the moral lighting. A Palestinian death could become a consequence. An Israeli death became a tragedy. An Iranian missile became aggression. An Israeli strike became prevention. American force became reluctant. Iranian deterrence became terrorism. This is how language conscripts the reader. The most dangerous propaganda is not the kind that lies about everything. It is the kind that tells many truths in the wrong moral order. Iran's government is repressive, true. Its regional policy has often been destructive. True. It has armed groups outside its borders. True. It has threatened Israel. True. It has crushed dissent. True. But from these truths, the war class built a falsehood that Iran, as a state and society, could be coerced into strategic submission at acceptable cost. The New York Times did not invent this falsehood. It merely gave it furniture. And then, when the war produced not transformation, but humiliation, not democratic awakening, but nationalist consolidation, not strategic clarity, but oil shocks and missile arithmetic, the columnists did what columnists do. They moved one paragraph down. The war was unwise, perhaps. Mistakes were made, certainly. But the real lesson is readiness. The deeper issue is procurement. America must adapt. Drones, magazines, industrial base, lessons learned. How to lose a war and keep your column. First, make the misreading respectable. Then call the catastrophe complicated. Then sell the next misreading as maturity. 5. The Casino Widow's Foreign Policy. There is a philosophical question America avoids because the answer would be too expensive. What kinds of wealth should be allowed to purchase influence over war? Miriam Adelson is not important merely because she is rich. America has many rich people, and most of them are engaged in the harmless work of making democracy unrecognizable. She is important because her wealth sits at the intersection of three American obscenities: gambling, politics, and foreign policy. The money came largely through casinos. Casinos are temples of engineered irrationality. They do not merely offer games. They design environments where time disappears, probability becomes decorative, compulsion is monetized, and human weakness is converted into quarterly performance. They are cathedrals of the near miss. They teach the soul to confuse loss with almost winning. Then the winnings of that system entered politics. Then politics began to resemble the casino. Double down, hide the odds, reward the whale, comp the loyalist, keep the lights flattering, remove clocks from the room. If the table turns against you, change the dealer and call it strategy. The question is not whether Miriam Adelson's political spending was legal. Much of what corrupts a republic is legal. The question is whether a society can remain self-governing when private fortunes extracted from compulsion are allowed to buy proximity to public violence. Do you deserve your wealth? That sounds impolite. Good. Some questions should be impolite. Politeness is often the velvet glove around theft. Do you deserve the access? Do you deserve the influence? Do you deserve the right to sit near power and whisper history into its ear? Do you deserve the ability to help shape war policy affecting millions of people whose sons, currencies, fuel prices, passports, bodies, and futures you will never be forced to count? The casino fortune is not incidental. It is the parable. A billionaire donor does not need to understand Iran. She needs to understand leverage. She does not need to persuade the public. She needs to fund the machinery that persuades the public. She does not need to command the military. She needs to help install and sustain politicians who know what kind of music the donor class likes to hear. This is oligarchy with a flag pin. And because Israel sits at the sacred center of her political imagination, American power becomes available for Israeli maximalism. Again, the issue is not Jewishness. The issue is not the existence of Israel. The issue is not the right of Israelis to security. The issue is whether one person's tribal attachment, inflated by casino wealth, should weigh more heavily in American foreign policy than the judgment, welfare, and democratic consent of the American people. The answer in a republic should be no. In a casino, the answer depends on the size of the chip stack. There is something grotesque about wealth built from addiction-shaping war against a country whose people have endured sanctions, repression, foreign interference, and ideological suffocation. There is something obscene about money extracted from the compulsions of ordinary gamblers being converted into influence over national security. The poor man who loses his paycheck at the tables is told he lacked discipline. The billionaire who helps push a country toward catastrophe is called a philanthropist. America has always been sentimental about its predators. The casino did not bomb Persia by itself. That would be too simple. The casino needed newspapers, campaigns, think tanks, consultants, senators, lobbyists, television studios, and moral language. It needed the fantasy that private wealth is wisdom. It needed the fantasy that support for Israel is automatically support for America. It needed the fantasy that Iran was a table with favorable odds. Then reality placed its bet. The house did not win, and when the house does not win, everyone else pays. 6. The burqa and the blind spot. Bill Maher has made a long career out of recognizing religious stupidity when it arrives in the correct costume. The burqa, the cleric, the chant, the beard, the medieval law, the visible submission of women, the gloomy theater of piety. All of this he sees clearly enough, often too clearly. The clarity becomes performance. The performance becomes identity. He laughs, and sometimes the laugh is deserved. Religious domination deserves mockery. Theocracy deserves contempt. Men who put God's name on women's bodies deserve to be laughed at until the laughter becomes law. But the interesting thing about tribalism is that it is easiest to see when someone else is wearing it. Maher recognizes tribalism when it has the wrong wardrobe. When tribal attachment appears not as a turban, but as Western civilization, not as a cleric, but as a liberal democracy, not as a holy city, but as a strategic ally, not as religious fanaticism, but as secular common sense, the diagnostic instruments begin to fail. The comedian who sees the absurdity of one sacred tribe becomes strangely reverent before another. This is not unique to him. It is the occupational hazard of the enlightened tribalist. Sam Harris can dissect Islamic fanaticism with the precision of a surgeon and then develop a mysterious hand tremor when Israeli state violence enters the operating room. Ben Shapiro is less mysterious. He carries the fusion openly. Israel is not merely a state in his imagination. It is a vindication machine, a civilizational fort, an answer to history, an extension of the self armed by the Pentagon and defended by syllogism. The problem is not attachment. Attachment is human. Jews have reasons to fear annihilation. Israelis have reasons to fear enemies. Palestinians have reasons to fear Israel. Iranians have reasons to fear America. Americans have reasons to fear being manipulated into another war by people who confuse their ancestral wounds with national strategy. The problem is not memory. The problem is when memory becomes immunity. The same people who mock Muslim grievance as backward can treat Jewish or Israeli grievance as permanent moral capital. The same people who ridicule clerical certainty can speak of Israel with a certainty that has merely changed clothes. The same people who demand that Muslims reform, secularize, universalize, and criticize their own communities often become philosophers of context when Israeli bombs fall. Suddenly, history matters. Trauma matters. Fear matters. Security matters. Bad neighborhoods matter. Human shields matter. Ancient hatred matters. The surrounding culture matters. The enemy's charter matters. The impossibility of purity in war matters. all of which may be true. The question is why such context is rationed by tribe. This is the blind spot. Not support for Israel, not sympathy for Jewish fear, not recognition that Israel faces real enemies. The blind spot is the inability to apply one's own moral method universally. If Islamic nationalism fuses religion, state power, grievance, masculinity, divine promise, and territorial fear, Maher sees the danger. If Jewish nationalism fuses memory, state power, grievance, masculinity, divine promise, and territorial fear, he sees complexity. If Christian nationalism does the same in America, half the country calls it freedom. The costumes differ. The structure repeats. That is what the secular tribalist cannot admit. He has not escaped the ancient machinery. He has merely chosen a tribe whose irrationality flatters his idea of reason. The central question is not whether Maher, Harris, Shapiro, or any other pundit has the right to defend Israel. Of course they do. The question is whether they can recognize when defense becomes possession, when possession becomes distortion, and when distortion becomes a threat to the country whose power they are invoking. Are you defending America's interest? Or are you renting America's military to your sacred attachments? The answer matters because satire ends where artillery begins. 7. The protesters we loved enough to endanger. The Iranian people had legitimate reasons to protest. This must be said plainly because both the Islamic Republic and its foreign enemies have incentives to erase it. The Islamic Republic wants every protest to be a foreign plot. Washington wants every protest to be a democratic stage awaiting American direction. Israel wants Iranian instability without responsibility for Iranian consequences. The exile imagination wants revolution without always counting the bodies. But the protests were real. The anger was real. The women were real. The grief was real. The disgust with corruption, coercion, hypocrisy, clerical domination, and security state violence was real. Then came the foreign love. Foreign powers have a special way of loving protesters. They love them as symbols. They love them as leverage. They love them as television. They love them as proof that the enemy is weak. They love them most intensely when their suffering can be converted into policy. And sometimes, if certain claims are true, they love them enough to arm them. The moment a foreign state attempts to send weapons into a protest movement, the moral terrain changes. It does not erase the legitimacy of the protest. It does not absolve the government that kills civilians. It does not mean the protesters were puppets. It means the protest has been endangered by people who will not face the crackdown they have helped invite. There is a brutal asymmetry here. The foreign power takes the strategic gamble. The protester absorbs the bullet. The regime receives the pretext. The pundit receives the moral evidence. The war planner receives the next slide. If the United States attempted to arm Iranian protesters, it did not merely support democracy. It attempted to convert domestic dissent into an instrument of proxy war. It blurred the line between peaceful protest and armed destabilization. It handed the Islamic Republic a gift wrapped in national security language. It made it easier for the state to say, "These are not citizens, these are agents." And then, when the Islamic Republic did what repressive states do, when it cracked down, arrested, tortured, shot, televised confessions, and called dissent treason, the same foreign actors could point to the bloodshed and say, "See, the regime is irredeemable." This is the dirty loop. Encourage protest. Arm, or attempt to arm, the protest. Watch the state crack down. Cite the crackdown as proof that the state cannot be reformed. Use that proof to justify war. Then forget the arming. Imagine the reverse. Imagine mass protests in America. Imagine economic crisis, police violence, institutional collapse, rage in the streets. Imagine Iran, China, Russia, or any foreign adversary quietly routing guns to protesters through armed intermediaries. Imagine those weapons appearing, or even being rumored to appear, amid demonstrations in Washington, Atlanta, Detroit, Los Angeles. Imagine federal buildings attacked or police shot, or even just enough uncertainty for the government to claim an armed foreign-backed network had entered the protests. Would Washington say, "We respect the democratic aspirations of our people"? No. It would call it hostile foreign intervention. It would call it insurrectionary arming. It would invoke domestic terrorism, intelligence operations, sedition, material support, emergency powers, and the full sacred vocabulary of state survival. Cable news would discover sovereignty in under 7 minutes. And yet Iran is expected to behave as though foreign weapons entering its unrest would be a footnote. This is hypocrisy so large it becomes architecture. Again, none of this excuses the Islamic Republic's violence. A state does not earn the right to massacre its citizens because foreigners interfere. Governments are responsible for their choices. The Islamic Republic has used foreign meddling, real and exaggerated, as a universal solvent against dissent. But foreign powers are also responsible for their choices. And if they truly cared about Iranian protesters, they would understand that the fastest way to isolate a dissident is to make him look like an instrument of the enemy. Iranian protesters did not need to be loved by empire. They needed not to be used by it. 8. The Israeli province of the American mind. There is an Israel that exists in the world. It has borders, though it argues over them. It has citizens, soldiers, courts, parties, criminals, poets, prime ministers, bereaved families, corrupt officials, dissidents, settlers, refuseniks, propagandists, children, fanatics, secular liberals, Mizrahi memories, Ashkenazi anxieties, Palestinian citizens, occupied subjects, nuclear ambiguity, trauma, genius, brutality, and fear. Then there is the Israel that exists in the American mind. That Israel is not a country. It is a moral instrument. It is the West's last outpost, democracy's frontier, the answer to Auschwitz, the proof that civilization can defend itself, the little Sparta with better startups, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the biblical receipt, the liberal conscience with an air force. A country can be criticized. An identity organ cannot. This is why American debates over Israel become deranged so quickly. Too many people are not discussing a state. They are defending a psychic structure. Israel becomes the place where American Christians stage apocalypse, American Jews negotiate inherited terror, American conservatives perform civilizational masculinity, American liberals outsource Holocaust memory, and American politicians collect donor checks while calling it principle. The result is not love of Israel. It is the instrumentalization of Israel by people who need it to perform roles no country can safely perform. Many Jews reject this. Many Israelis reject it. Many Palestinians know more about Israeli reality than American Zionists who visit twice, donate heavily, and speak as though the entire region were a summer camp with missiles. Many American Jews have opposed Netanyahu, occupation, settlement expansion, Gaza's destruction, and war with Iran at real social cost. Christian Zionists, meanwhile, often manage to be more fanatical about Israel than many Israelis, partly because their love ends in an eschatological footnote no Jewish person should find comforting. So the issue is not Jews. It is not Jewishness. It is not even support for Israel. The issue is foreign state sacralization inside American power. A faction of American elites has treated Israel not as a foreign country with interests that sometimes align with America's and sometimes do not, but as a sacred exception. Its fears are policy inputs. Its narratives are intelligence. Its wars are moral tests. Its enemies become America's enemies, often without the courtesy of a democratic argument. This is not alliance. It is possession. They did not support Israel as a country. They defended it as an alibi. An alibi for militarism. An alibi for Islamophobia. An alibi for American toughness. An alibi for donor politics. An alibi for civilizational panic. An alibi for avoiding the Palestinian corpse in the room. The loyalty question must be handled carefully, because ugly people have asked ugly versions of it. The question is not whether Jewish Americans are loyal. That is poison. The question is whether any American political actor, Jewish, Christian, secular, evangelical, billionaire, pundit, senator, editor, or think tank fellow, can distinguish American interests from Israeli maximalism when the two diverge. If the answer is no, that person is not necessarily a traitor, but he is unfit to shape American war policy. The same standard should apply to Iranian Americans who want the United States to destroy Iran in the name of liberation. The same standard should apply to Cuban Americans, Armenian Americans, Saudi lobbyists, evangelical Zionists, defense contractors, Ukrainian advocates, Turkish nationalists, and every diaspora or interest group that seeks to convert American power into the instrument of a sacred map. A republic can listen to attachments. It cannot be governed by them. The tragedy of the Iran war is that America allowed one foreign state's security mythology, one donor class's tribal fixation, one media ecosystem's moral laziness, and one empire's hunger for relevance to converge into a single hallucination. Israel had interests. Iran had interests. America had interests. The pundits called the confusion strategy. 9. The Middle East was redefined, unfortunately, by reality. They said Israel had redefined the Middle East. In a sense, they were correct. The Middle East was redefined by the exposure of Israeli limits, American limits, Iranian resilience, Gulf anxiety, global energy vulnerability, and the astonishing inability of the war class to distinguish tactical success from strategic transformation. This deserves a correction notice. Correction. An earlier version of this empire stated that Iran was weak. Iran was, in fact, capable of absorbing damage, striking targets, bypassing defenses, imposing costs, retaining state capacity, and forcing negotiations under conditions less favorable to Washington than advertised. The empire regrets the error, but will continue publishing. Correction. An earlier version of this pundit class stated that Israel had restored deterrence. The sentence should have read, Israel had produced impressive tactical effects while deepening the strategic conditions for a wider war. The pundit class regrets the nuance. Correction. An earlier version of this newspaper suggested that the region had been remade. The region had merely been inflamed, rearranged, misread, and billed to the American taxpayer. Correction. An earlier version of this donor strategy assumed that money could purchase history. History declined the transaction. The phrase, Israel redefined the Middle East, was always revealing because it confused action with control. Israel can act. It can strike, infiltrate, assassinate, sabotage, intercept, degrade, punish, and surprise. It is a formidable military and intelligence power. It has real enemies and real capabilities. But action is not control. Damage is not victory. Shock is not order. Assassination is not architecture. Air superiority is not political settlement. They mistook damage for victory. That mistake became contagious. Hezbollah was degraded. Therefore, Iran was exposed. Iran was exposed. Therefore, the regime was vulnerable. The regime was vulnerable. Therefore, the moment was historic. The moment was historic. Therefore, America must act. America acted. Therefore, the consequences became complicated. At every step, the conclusion arrived before the evidence. Iran, for its part, did not need to win in the American sense. It did not need to occupy anything. It did not need to defeat America symmetrically. It did not need to become admirable. It needed to survive, impose costs, retain deterrent credibility, and demonstrate that the price of coercion would be higher than the fantasy advertised. That is the cruel arithmetic of asymmetric power. The stronger side must achieve. The weaker side must endure. America had force, but not political control. Israel had tactical brilliance, but not strategic omnipotence. Iran had losses, but not collapse. The region had fear, but not submission. The global economy had nerves, and Iran knew where many of them ran. Hormuz became the geography that defeated the metaphor. The war class had spoken in abstractions: deterrence, degradation, regime vulnerability, regional architecture. Reality answered with shipping lanes, insurance rates, missile inventories, oil flows, air defenses, domestic legitimacy, and the oldest truth in statecraft: the enemy gets to adapt. What made the defeat so bitter was not that America lacked power. America had enormous power. It always does. The defeat came from applying power to a false mental model. A hammer is impressive until it is used to repair a watch. The Middle East was redefined, yes, not by Israel's mastery, by reality's refusal to perform. 10. No one is guilty in the passive voice. After the disaster, the sentences become very smooth. Concerns were raised, signals were misread. Assumptions proved optimistic. The intelligence picture was mixed. The administration faced difficult choices. Regional dynamics shifted. The situation evolved. No one says, "I was wrong in the direction of blood." That sentence is unavailable in Washington. It has no sponsor. The donor will not say, "I used my wealth to distort the judgment of a republic." The columnist will not say, "I made war feel morally intelligent." The editor will not say, "I laundered one state's strategic fantasy into the idiom of liberal seriousness." The senator will not say, "I outsourced my conscience to donors and called it national security." The think tank fellow will not say, "My white paper was tribal desire with footnotes." The media owner will not say, "I elevated ideologues who turned American politics into a foreign policy casino." The pundit will not say, "I hated the Islamic Republic so much that I forgot Iran existed." Instead, everyone gathers for lessons. Lessons are the American substitute for accountability. A lesson does not require punishment. A lesson does not require resignation. A lesson does not require shame. A lesson allows the guilty to become instructors. The same people who helped produce catastrophe are invited to explain what catastrophe teaches us. They sit beneath soft lighting and discuss complexity. Complexity is where responsibility goes to retire. There must be a price for catastrophic influence. Not vengeance, not censorship, not confiscation because someone held a repellent opinion. A republic cannot survive if the state punishes political speech whenever the ruling faction decides that speech was dangerous. That road leads to the same authoritarianism we claim to oppose. But neither can a republic survive if the penalty for misleading it into disaster is continued access. The price should begin with record. A public archive of claims. Who said Iran was weak? Who said Hezbollah was finished? Who said Israel had remade the region? Who said the Islamic Republic was irredeemable in a way that made force sound humane? Who minimized retaliation? Who treated diplomacy as appeasement? Who converted Iranian protest into regime change theater? Who used Israeli sources without sufficient skepticism? Who published strategic fantasy as news analysis? Who funded the politicians who acted on it? Dates, names, quotes, funding, corrections, outcomes. Let no one hide in the fog. Then hearings, not censorship hearings, evidence hearings. How did Israeli claims move through American media? Which think tanks received money from whom? Which donors gained access to which officials? Which pundits were platformed after repeated errors? Which newspapers corrected the record, and which merely changed tense? Then, disclosure. Think tanks should disclose foreign and donor funding prominently. Media outlets should disclose when national security stories rely heavily on officials from a state seeking American action. Campaign finance structures should be dragged into daylight. Super PAC coordination should be scrutinized. FARA should be enforced where agency exists. Editorial boards should conduct public postmortems. Prestigious error should become reputationally expensive. Not prison for opinion. Disgrace for malpractice. The distinction matters. A society must allow people to be wrong. It need not reward those who are always wrong toward war. The poor man who makes one bad bet in a casino loses rent, dignity, perhaps his family. The billionaire who helps make one bad bet with a country loses nothing. She attends another event. The columnist writes another column. The editor commissions another reflection. The think tank fellow becomes a senior advisor in the next administration. This is not accountability. It is aristocracy. The republic requires a harsher memory. No one is guilty in the passive voice, so the first act of justice is grammar. Name the subject. Name the verb. Name the object. Name the dead. Name the donors. Name the newspapers. Name the fantasies. Name the country that paid. 11. The Republic against the casino. The issue was never Iran alone. Iran was the table. America was the gambler. Israel was the favorite chip. The donors were the whales. The newspapers were the cocktail servers whispering that the odds had improved. The pundits were the men in nice jackets explaining that hesitation was for cowards. The think tanks were the pit bosses. The public was told that the next hand would restore deterrence, democracy, credibility, civilization, and perhaps the lost masculinity of the republic. Then the cards turned. A republic is supposed to be a form of collective judgment, imperfect, corruptible, often hypocritical, but still committed in theory to the idea that public power must answer to public reason. War, especially, is supposed to belong to the people through their representatives, their institutions, their informed consent, their right to know why their money, sons, daughters, credibility, and future are being risked. A casino is different. A casino does not require judgment. It requires appetite. It requires lights, noise, near misses, free drinks, false time, and the managed disappearance of consequence. A casino does not ask whether the gambler should be gambling. It asks how long he can be kept at the table. America has confused the two. It calls itself a republic, but increasingly behaves like a casino for sacred lobbies, billionaire donors, defense contractors, prestige media fantasies, and foreign attachments with domestic checkbooks. Policy becomes wager. War becomes atmosphere. Citizens become collateral. Failure becomes another opportunity to double down. Iran exposed this. The Islamic Republic had a name. Iran had a history. Israel had interests. America had citizens. Palestinian suffering had reality. Iranian dissent had dignity. American taxpayers had a claim. Jewish fear had a history. Muslim suffering had a history. Christian nationalism had a mirror. The region had complexity. The world had limits. The tragedy was that the people who claimed to understand all of this could not tell these things apart. They collapsed Iran into the Islamic Republic. They collapsed Israel into innocence. They collapsed Palestinians into inconvenience. They collapsed American interests into Israeli escalation. They collapsed Iranian protesters into regime change material. They collapsed casino wealth into democratic speech. They collapsed tribal attachment into moral clarity. They collapsed war into seriousness. And when the structure collapsed, they called it a lesson. But the lesson is not that America needs better drones, though it may. The lesson is not that Israel needs better strategy, though it certainly does. The lesson is not that Iran is noble, because it is governed by men who have often betrayed the nobility of their own people. The lesson is that a republic cannot survive if its imagination is rented out to the highest bidder with the deepest wound. America must decide whether it is a country or a gaming floor. If it is a country, then its foreign policy must answer to its citizens, not to casino fortunes, sacred lobbies, elite newspapers, or pundits whose tribalism has learned to quote liberalism. If it is a country, it must be able to say to Israel what it says to every other state. You are real. Your fears are real. Your crimes are real. Your interests are not automatically ours. If it is a country, it must be able to say to Iran, your government may be repressive, but your civilization is not a target. If it is a country, it must be able to say to its own wealthy, your money is not wisdom. If it is a country, it must be able to say to its newspapers, your prestige is not innocence. And if it is a casino, then let us at least stop pretending. Let the donors sit openly at the war table with chips made of other people's lives. Let the columnists wear uniforms sponsored by defense contractors. Let the newspapers print odds instead of analysis. Let every editorial board publish its correction in advance. We may be wrong. You will pay. But if there remains even a remnant of Republican seriousness, then the reckoning must begin where the war began, in language. Iran was not the mullahs. Israel was not the West. America was not credibility. War was not help. Failure was not complexity. Oligarchy was not speech. Tribalism was not strategy. The casino did not bomb Persia alone. It needed a country willing to forget the difference between judgment and appetite. It needed newspapers willing to polish fantasy until it resembled fact. It needed donors willing to mistake wealth for wisdom. It needed pundits willing to see fanaticism everywhere except in the mirror. It needed politicians willing to call capture conviction. It needed citizens exhausted enough to let the serious people speak. And now the serious people have spoken. They called it strategy. It was only tribalism with a budget. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline. Thanks for reading Language Matters. Subscribe for free to receive new posts and support my work.